The candles had burned to their halfway mark by the time the Duke of Westhaven noticed the piece of paper beside his plate. It was small, no larger than a playing card, folded once with a precise, deliberate crease. It sat between his water glass and the silver bread knife, an object so out of place in the ruthless order of his dining table that for a moment he simply stared at it as though it were an insect that had crawled in from the garden. Emery did not touch it immediately. He looked down the length of the table. All 24 chairs empty. All 24 place settings absent. The mahogany gleaming under the chandelier like a dark river flowing toward no one. He looked at the door through which the footman had retreated exactly 90 seconds ago, as was the rule. He looked at the windows where the October dusk was pressing its cold face against the glass. Then he picked up the paper and unfolded it. A single line written in a careful, sloping hand. The ink was common. The paper was a scrap torn from a household ledger. It read, "The only true companion of the solitary man is the silence that understands him." He read it twice. He turned the paper over. Nothing on the reverse. No signature. No mark. No explanation. He held it for a long moment, his thumb resting against the ink as though testing whether the words were real. Then, without expression, he folded the paper again and slipped it into the breast pocket of his coat. He picked up his knife and fork. He ate his supper. He finished every bite, and the footman, when he came to clear, noted with private astonishment that the plate was clean for the first time in over a year. No one had told Emery to eat. No one had cajoled him, scolded him, or sat across from him with anxious eyes and pleading conversation. Someone had simply left words beside his plate, and the words had done what months of silence could not. The following morning the household discovered what had happened, and the storm broke. Mrs. Selmore stood at the head of the long table in the servants' hall, her hands clasped at her waist, her face an arrangement of angles and displeasure. She was a tall woman, narrow as a blade, with iron gray hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her temples taut. She had served Aldermere Hall for 17 years, first under the old Duke and now under his son, and in that time she had cultivated a reputation for efficiency so absolute that even the butler, Mr. Sivan Crail, deferred to her. In matters of household discipline, she did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. The quiet itself was the weapon. "Someone," she began, her gaze moving across the assembled staff like a lantern sweeping a dark room, "placed an unauthorized item at His Grace's table last evening. A piece of paper. A note." She let the word hang in the air, as though it were an accusation of murder. I will not speculate on the motive. I will not entertain excuses. I will simply make the position of this household clear. She unfolded a sheet of paper of her own and read from it. No member of staff is to place any item written or otherwise at the Duke's table beyond the prescribed setting. No messages, no tokens, no objects of any kind. The dining room is to be set according to the established order, and then vacated. Any deviation from this instruction will result in immediate dismissal without character. She looked up. End quote. Her black eyes settled on a figure at the far end of the table. A small, slight girl with dark hair pinned under a plain cap, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the scrubbed wood in front of her. Nell, the new girl. She had been at Aldermere for 5 weeks, hired on the strength of references that Mrs. Selmore had personally verified, and assigned to the dining room rotation on her 3rd day. "The dining room is your responsibility on alternate evenings, Nell," Mrs. Selmore said. Her voice did not sharpen. It did not need to. "You were on duty last night." Every face in the room turned toward the girl. The cook, Mrs. D. Harrow, paused with her teacup halfway to her lips. Thomas, the hallboy, stared openly. The 2 senior housemaids, Bridget and Alma, exchanged a glance that carried the unmistakable satisfaction of women who had found someone to stand below them. Nell did not look up. She did not flush or stammer or protest. She simply said, in a voice so quiet It barely carried the length of the table. I set the table as instructed. Mrs. Selmore, I placed nothing else. The housekeeper regarded her for a long, frigid moment. Then someone else entered the dining room after you. Someone with access. Someone bold enough to leave a personal note for the Duke of Westhaven. Her tone made the act sound as scandalous as if someone had stolen the family silver. I intend to discover who, and when I do, that person will not spend another night under this roof. She folded her paper, tucked it into her apron pocket, and left the room. The silence she left behind was not empty. It was full of sidelong glances and whispered theories, and every one of them pointed at Nell. She knew it. She could feel the weight of their suspicion like a hand pressing between her shoulder blades. She finished her porridge, rinsed her bowl, and went to collect her cleaning supplies from the cupboard. Beneath the back stairs. She did not hurry. She did not dawdle. She moved with the practiced economy of a woman who understood that the only safe speed was the one that attracted no attention. But the notes did not stop. 3 nights later, the Duke sat down to his solitary supper and found another folded paper, this time tucked beneath the rim of his soup bowl. He opened it with the same deliberate calm. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. He recognized the thought. It was Seneca, not a direct quotation, but a faithful paraphrase, the kind a person makes when they have absorbed a text so thoroughly it has become part of their own thinking. He placed the note in his pocket beside the first. He ate his soup. He finished his fish. He sat for a long time afterward, his wine untouched, his eyes resting on the empty chair at the far end of the table. The third note arrived, 2 days after that, folded into his napkin with such care that it did not fall out until he lifted the cloth to his lap. The wound is the place where the light enters. He did not know the source. It did not matter. The words settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward through his chest, his shoulders, the rigid architecture of his grief. The fourth note was different. It was not a quotation. It was an observation, written in the same careful hand. The oak outside the east window has held its leaves longer than any other tree on the grounds. I think it is too stubborn to let go. He almost smiled. The muscles of his face, so long unused for that purpose, resisted the movement like a rusted hinge, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of light in a room that had been dark for a very long time. Mrs. Ty. Selmore was beside herself. She interrogated the kitchen staff. She examined the dining room before and after each supper. She stationed Bridget in the corridor to watch the door. Nothing. The notes appeared as if placed by a phantom. The table would be inspected and found bare. The door would be watched, and still a small folded paper would materialize beside the Duke's plate. It was, the staff whispered, as though the house itself were writing to him. Nell endured the suspicion with an outward calm so complete it infuriated the housekeeper. She performed her duties without error. She spoke only when spoken to. She ate her meals alone at the end of the servants' table, her gaze lowered, her expression composed. When Bridget made a pointed remark about girls who thought themselves clever, Nell said nothing. When Alma accidentally spilled a bucket of filthy water across the floor, Nell had just finished scrubbing. Forcing her to begin again, Nell simply wrung out her cloth and started over. She did not complain. She did not cry. She did not give Mrs. Selmore the satisfaction of a single crack in her composure. But at night, alone in her narrow attic room, she allowed herself the small private act that had started everything. She would sit on the edge of her iron bed, a stub of candle burning on the windowsill, and write. The words came from memory, from the vast library of texts her father had read aloud to her throughout her childhood, from the philosophy and poetry that had been the language of their home. She wrote them on scraps of paper she saved from the household accounts, carefully trimming the edges with her sewing scissors, and then, at a moment she had calculated with the precision of a clockmaker, she would deliver them. She knew the rhythms of the house. She knew that the footman, Gerald, took exactly 4 minutes to carry the final course from the kitchen to the dining room, and that during 2 of those minutes the corridor outside the dining room was empty. She knew that Mrs. Selmore took her own supper at 7:15, a ritual as fixed as the tides. She knew the creak of every floorboard, the sigh of every door hinge, the angle from which the candlelight could betray a shadow. She was not reckless. She was meticulous, and she was driven by something far deeper than an impulse of kindness. But the kindness had been real. That first night 5 weeks ago had not been part of any plan. She had been setting the table, laying out the heavy silver with the care Mrs. Selmore demanded, counting forks, aligning knives, when she had paused and truly looked at the room for the first time. 24 chairs, one place setting. The chandelier blazing above a table meant for a family, for laughter, for the clatter of conversation and the clink of glasses raised in celebration. And at the head of it, a single plate, a single glass, a single man eating in a silence so vast it seemed to hum. She had seen him once through the half-open door as she was leaving. Just a glimpse. A tall figure, dark-haired, his face cast downward, his fork moving without purpose. He was not eating. He was performing the act of eating, going through the motions, because the alternative, to stop entirely, would be an admission of something he was not yet ready to name. She recognized it. She recognized it because she had lived it. The mechanical continuation of daily life when the heart has gone quiet. The refusal to stop moving because stopping means feeling, and feeling means drowning. She had written the note without thinking, a line that had come to her, unbidden, from a conversation with her father years ago. She had folded it and placed it beside his water glass with hands that trembled only slightly. It was a foolish risk, a dangerous sentimentality. But it was also the first true thing she had done since arriving at Aldermere Hall, and every true thing since then had been a lie. Her name was not Nell. Her name was Cassia Thorne, and she had not come to this house to leave notes for a grieving duke. She had come to reclaim a life that had been stolen from her. Her father, Aldous Thorne, had been one of the most respected antiquarians and translators in the south of England. A quiet, brilliant man with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that could fill a room. He had spent his career cataloging and translating rare manuscripts for the great houses and university libraries. His greatest commission had come from the old Duke of Westhaven, who had invited him to Aldermere to catalog the hall's extraordinary collection of classical texts, a library assembled over generations and considered one of the finest private collections in the country. Cassia had been 12 years old when her father first brought her to Aldermere. She remembered the long carriage ride through the Yorkshire dales, the first sight of the house rising from the moorland like a ship from a grey sea, the vast library with its leather spines and golden dust motes, and the smell of centuries. She remembered playing in the gardens with the old Duke's daughter, a bright, laughing girl named Honora, who had a passion for wildflowers and a talent for mischief. They had been friends, instant and fierce, the way children are before the world teaches them about station and propriety. Her father had worked at Aldermere for 3 summers. He had translated a collection of Stoic manuscripts that the old Duke prized above all others, producing annotated volumes of such beauty and scholarship that they had become treasures in their own right. He had been happy there. It was the only time Cassia could remember her father being truly, unreservedly happy. Then the old Duke died. The commissions ended. Her father returned to their cottage in Devon and continued his work for other patrons, but his health had begun to fail. 2 years ago, he had died of a fever that had swept through the village, and Cassia, his only child, had been left with what should have been a secure, if modest, inheritance. Briar Cottage, the small Devon property that had been in the Thorne family for 3 generations, a collection of annotated manuscripts and first editions, worth a considerable sum, and a life she could have built quietly and with dignity. She never received any of it. A man named Reynard Selmore, a distant cousin of Cassia's late mother, had appeared within days of the funeral. He was a solicitor's clerk with an oily smile and an intimate knowledge of probate law. He produced a revised will, one that left everything, the cottage, the books, the small savings, to himself. The witnesses were his associates. The solicitor who filed it was a man Selmore had cultivated for years with small favors and smaller bribes. Cassia, grief-stricken and alone, had been swept aside like a leaf in a gutter. Selmore sold the books within a month. He claimed Briar Cottage and installed tenants. He gave Cassia £4 and a warning. "Make no trouble, girl, or I will see you in a workhouse." She had been 19 years old. For a year, she had survived on the charity of a retired clergyman who had known her father, sleeping in a back room of his parsonage and earning a few shillings by tutoring the village children in Latin and Greek. It was the clergyman, a careful and thoughtful man, named Reverend Osprey, who had changed the course of her life. He had been sorting through old correspondence when he found a letter from Aldous Thorne, written 6 months before his death. In it, her father mentioned that he had placed his original will and the deed to Briar Cottage among the manuscripts at Aldermere Hall, hidden within a specific volume, as a precaution against interference by his wife's relations. He had written to the old Duke, asking him to safeguard the documents. But the old Duke was dead by then, and the letter had apparently never reached his son. The proof existed. It was at Aldermere. And the woman who now ruled that household with an iron will and a ring of keys was Renard Selmore's elder sister. Cassia had understood immediately. Mrs. Sturbs, Williman. Selmore might not know about the hidden documents, but she would be instinctively hostile to any threat to her brother's gains and to her own position. If Cassia arrived at Aldermere as herself, as the daughter of Aldous Thorne, she would be turned away at the gate. She had to become someone else. She had to become invisible. So Cassia Thorne vanished, and Nell, a quiet, capable orphan girl with carefully forged references and a talent for hard work, appeared at the servants' entrance of Aldermere Hall on a cold September morning and asked for a position. Mrs. Selmore had looked her up and down with the appraising eye of a woman who valued obedience above all other virtues. She saw a small plain girl with dark hair and steady hands. She saw a girl who would scrub and sweep and cause no trouble. She did not see a scholar's daughter with a command of 5 languages and a memory trained to catalog and cross-reference rare texts. She did not see a woman with a purpose so fierce it burned like a coal behind her quiet gray-green eyes. She certainly did not see the girl who had once played in these very gardens with the Duke's dead sister. 5 weeks in, and Cassia had mapped the house. She knew every corridor, every locked door, every window that could be opened from outside. She knew the location of the manuscript room, a long, narrow chamber on the ground floor behind the library, where her father's work was stored in glass-fronted cabinets. She knew that the Duke spent most of his daylight hours in the adjacent study, and most of his evenings alone in the dining room, and most of his nights walking the grounds like a man who had forgotten how to sleep. She knew about Lady Honora. The whole household lived in the shadow of what had happened. The Duke's younger sister, the bright, wild girl Cassia had once known, had drowned in the estate lake 18 months ago. A riding accident, they said. Her horse had bolted near the water's edge. She had been thrown. She could not swim. By the time the groom reached her, she was gone. Emery had been the one to carry her body back to the house. He had not been the same since. The grief that saturated Aldermere was not the sharp, dramatic kind. It was the slow, suffocating variety, the kind that seeps into stone and wood and cloth until the very air tastes of it. The Duke did not weep or rage. He simply withdrew. He dismissed the social secretary. He canceled every engagement. He closed the music room where Honora had played the pianoforte. He sealed her chambers. And he began to eat his suppers alone, in a dining room built for 24, in a silence that the staff had learned never to break. He was punishing himself. Cassia could see it plainly, even if no one else in the house would say it aloud. He believed he should have been there. He believed he should have saved her. And so he sat each evening at that enormous table and served himself a penance of solitude, as though by suffering enough he might somehow earn forgiveness from a sister who could no longer give it. She had not intended to reach out to him. Her mission was the manuscript room, not the dining room. But that first evening, seeing the vast emptiness of his table, she had felt something crack open inside her, a fellow feeling so powerful it overwhelmed her caution. She knew what it was to eat alone. She knew what it was to carry grief in silence, to move through days that felt like corridors with no doors. She had written the note because for one unguarded moment, her own loneliness had recognized his, and now the notes had become something she could not stop. Each one was a risk. Each one brought her closer to discovery and dismissal. Each one endangered the mission that was her only reason for being in this house. But each one also reached across the vast cold distance between two people drowning in separate rooms, and for a few seconds, in the space between the folding of the paper and the placing of it beside his plate, she was not Nell, and he was not the Duke. They were simply two human beings in the dark, and one of them was speaking. The Duke, for his part, had begun to pay attention, not to the mystery of the notes. He had made no effort to discover their author. Some instinct, deeper than curiosity, warned him that knowing would end the thing itself, and he was not yet ready for that. The notes had become the only conversation he valued, the only voice in his life that asked nothing of him except that he listen. But he had begun to pay attention to the house around him, and specifically to the quiet, self-contained girl he had been told was causing trouble. He first truly noticed Nell on a Tuesday afternoon. He was crossing the upper landing when he heard a sound from the corridor below, Mrs. Selmore's voice, clipped and precise, delivering a reprimand. He paused at the balustrade and looked down. The housekeeper was standing over Nell, who was on her knees beside a bucket, pointing at a section of floor near the skirting. The words drifted up to him. "This is unacceptable. Look at this. There is grime in the grouting that a child could see. You will do the entire corridor again. And when you are finished, you will report to the laundry where the pressing is behind." The corridor was 40 feet long. The grouting misses. Selmore was indicating was spotless. Emery could see it from where he stood. The floor gleamed. There was no grime. The reprimand was invented, a performance of authority for its own sake. He watched the girl's response. She did not argue. She did not look up at the housekeeper with resentment or tears. She simply said, "Yes, Mrs. Selmore," and dipped her brush back into the bucket. Her movements were controlled, measured, utterly without drama. When the housekeeper turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the very floor she had just called filthy, Nell paused for a single breath. Just one. She closed her eyes. Then she opened them and began to scrub. That one breath. That single, private moment of composure. Emery felt it land somewhere in his chest like an arrow finding its mark. It was not weakness. It was the opposite. It was the moment a person gathers themselves, draws in the fraying edges of their dignity, and decides to continue. He had stood at Honora's graveside and taken exactly such a breath. He recognized it the way one recognizes a word in a language one has not spoken for years. Mrs. Selmore had described Nell to him as sly, a girl who was above herself. Too quiet, she had said, as though quietness were a character flaw. She watches everything. She is always listening. She is not what she seems. Standing on that landing, looking down at the small figure scrubbing a floor that did not need scrubbing, Emery felt the first fissure in his trust. That evening, he did something he had not done in months. After supper, instead of retreating immediately to his study, he went to his desk and opened the top drawer. Inside was a small leather case, the kind used for visiting cards. He opened it and laid out the notes, 7 of them now, side by side on the green leather surface of the desk. He studied the handwriting. It was not the hand of someone poorly educated. The letters were formed with the fluency of long practice, the kind of penmanship that comes not from copying a copybook, but from years of writing naturally and often. The ink was cheap, the paper rough, but the hand itself was accomplished. He read the notes again slowly, this time the quotation from Seneca, the paraphrase of Aurelius, an observation about the persistence of oak trees, a line about the sound rain makes on a window when no one else is awake to hear it, a thought about how silence changes its meaning depending on whether it is chosen or imposed. Every note revealed a mind steeped in classical philosophy, in close observation of the natural world, and in a loneliness so intimate it could only have been lived. This was not a kitchen maid's prank. This was not a bid for attention or a servant's attempt to curry favor. This was something else entirely. The most recent note had unsettled him most. It read, "Grief is not a room to live in. It is a corridor to walk through, and there is a door at the end." He picked it up and held it to the lamplight as though the paper itself might reveal its author. Then he set it down and looked across the room at the bookshelves that lined the far wall. He had a memory, faint and unreliable, of a conversation with his father years ago about a scholar who had worked on the family's manuscript collection, a translator of exceptional skill. The man had produced annotated volumes of Seneca and Epictetus that were still on these shelves, works of such clarity and beauty that the old duke had spoken of them with reverence. What was his name? Emery could not recall. It had been years, and his father's papers were in disarray. But the thought lodged itself and would not leave. He stood and walked to the window. The grounds were dark. A thin rain was falling, silvering the glass. Down in the kitchen garden, a light burned in the window of the laundry room. Someone was still working. He thought of the girl on her knees in the corridor, scrubbing a clean floor without complaint, and he thought of the notes in his desk drawer, and he felt, for the first time in 18 months, the stirring of something that was not grief. It was curiosity, it was doubt, and beneath, both quiet and persistent as a heartbeat, it was the beginning of a question he did not yet know how to ask. Who are you, and what are you doing in my house? We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Lady Sibel arrived at Aldermere on a Friday, unannounced, as was her habit. She was Emery's aunt, his late mother's elder sister, a woman of 73 who moved through the world with the energy of someone half her age and the bluntness of someone who had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of her. She kept a small house in Harrogate and visited Aldermere whenever the mood struck her, which was often enough to be a nuisance and seldom enough to be a novelty. She appeared in the entrance hall at 10:30 in the morning, her traveling coat dusted with rain, her silver hair escaping from beneath a hat that had been fashionable in the previous decade, and her sharp blue eyes already cataloguing every detail of the house with the speed of a woman who had been watching people lie to her for over half a century. "The house smells of beeswax and misery," she announced to Mr. Crail, who had come to take her coat, in equal measure. "Where is my nephew?" "His Grace is in the study, my lady." "Of course he is. Have someone bring tea." "Not to the study. To the morning room. If he wants to see me, he can come out of his cave." She swept through the house like a weather system. Within 20 minutes she had inspected the kitchens, commented unfavorably on the temperature of the hallways, complimented Mrs. Harrow on her scones, and reduced the hallboy Thomas to a stammering wreck by asking him directly whether anyone in this house ever laughed. It was during this tour that she encountered Nell. The girl was polishing the banister of the main staircase, her cloth moving in slow, thorough circles. She did not see Lady Sibel approach. She was absorbed in her work, but it was a particular kind of absorption, the kind that allows the mind to move freely while the hands are occupied. There was a stillness about her, a self-contained quiet that Lady Sibel noticed immediately, because it was the same quality she had observed in scholars, musicians, and nuns, people whose inner lives were richer than their outer circumstances. "You are new," Lady Sibel said. Nell looked up, startled. She curtsied quickly. "Yes, my lady. I have been here 6 weeks." Lady Sibel studied her. The girl's eyes were gray-green, unusually intelligent, and they met hers with a directness that was neither insolent nor submissive. It was simply honest. "What is your name, Nell, my lady? Nell, what?" A hesitation, barely perceptible. "Just Nell, my lady. I am an orphan." Lady Sibel's gaze dropped to the girl's hands. They were red and rough from work, but the fingers were long and slender, and they held the polishing cloth with a particular precision. "You polish a banister the way a pianist approaches a keyboard with attention." She looked back at the girl's face. "Do you play?" Something flickered behind those gray-green eyes. Pain, quickly mastered. "I used to, my lady. A long time ago." Lady Sibel nodded slowly. She had lived long enough to recognize when someone was telling a truth that contained a much larger, hidden truth. She said nothing more. She simply patted the girl's arm and continued on her way. But the encounter stayed with her like a pebble in a shoe. She found Emery in the morning room, standing by the window with the particular rigidity of a man who would rather be anywhere else. He was thinner than when she had last seen him. The bones of his face, always sharp, were now prominent, but his eyes, when he turned to greet her, held something she had not seen in them for over a year. A restlessness, a searching quality. "You look less dead than last time," she said, settling herself in a chair and reaching for the tea. "Only slightly, but I will take what I can get." "You are a comfort as always, Aunt." "I am not here to comfort you. I am here to see if you have stopped trying to entomb yourself alive." She poured 2 cups and pushed one toward him. "Sit down, Emery. You are making the room feel smaller." He sat, not because she commanded it, but because she was the only person in his life who still spoke to him as though he were a human being rather than a title. She had that right. She had held him as a baby. She had taught him to ride. She had wept at Honora's funeral, and then gripped his arm and told him he was a fool when he had refused to weep himself. "I have heard something peculiar," she said, stirring her tea with a small silver spoon. "The servants talk, you know. They always do, and yours talk more than most because they have nothing else to occupy them in this silent tomb. There is a story about notes." Emery's expression did not change, but his hand, resting on the arm of the chair, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Gossip, perhaps. But interesting gossip. Someone is leaving you messages beside your supper plate. Handwritten notes. And you, a man who has not shown interest in a living soul for 18 months, are keeping them." He said nothing. "Who writes them?" she asked, her eyes bright and probing. "I do not know." "You have not tried to find out?" "No. Why not?" The question hung in the air. He looked away from her toward the window where the rain was streaking the glass. "Because if I find out, they will stop." Lady Sibel set down her teaspoon with a gentle clink. She looked at her nephew for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its sharpness. It was soft now, and unbearably kind. "You are afraid," she said. "Not of the notes, of what they mean. Someone in this house cares enough about your suffering to risk their position, their livelihood, to reach you. And that terrifies you. Because caring is the thing you have been trying to stop doing, since Honora died. Do not speak her name. I will speak her name. Honora, Honora, your sister who loved this house and loved you, and would be heartbroken to see what you have become. A ghost rattling around a mansion, eating alone, speaking to no one, punishing yourself for a death you could not have prevented." She leaned forward. "Grief is not a duty, Emery. It is not a debt you owe. It is a wound, and wounds are meant to heal. Someone in this house understands that. Even if you do not, perhaps instead of hiding from the notes, you should be asking yourself why they reached you when nothing else could." He did not answer. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. But Lady Sibel saw the muscle in his cheek twitch, the almost invisible tremor that meant her words had found their target. She picked up her teacup and changed the subject to the state of the garden, and they spoke of safer things. But the arrow was lodged, and both of them knew it. That evening, Lady Sybil dined with Emery in the dining room. The first person to sit at that table with him since Honora's death. She insisted, and he did not resist. No note appeared that night. The author, whoever they were, had recognized that the Duke was not alone and had stayed their hand. Lady Sybil noticed this and filed it away as evidence of a discretion that was, in its own way, as eloquent as the notes themselves. She left 2 days later. As her carriage pulled away from the front steps, she looked back at the great house and said, under her breath, "Find her, Emery, before she disappears." The days that followed were the hardest Cassia had endured since arriving at Aldermere. Lady Sybil's visit had disrupted the household routine, and Mrs. Briss Selmore, already on edge about the notes, had responded by tightening her grip on every aspect of staff discipline. Cassia bore the worst of it. She was removed from the dining room rotation entirely and reassigned to the heaviest, most punishing tasks. The cellar stores needed reorganizing. The copper pans required polishing until they burned the skin. The attic rooms, unused for years and thick with dust, needed airing and scrubbing. It was a campaign of exhaustion. Cassia recognized it for what it was. Mrs. Selmore could not prove she was the author of the notes, but she could make her so tired, so beaten down, so consumed with labor, that she would have no energy left for anything else. It was effective. By the end of each day, Cassia could barely climb the stairs to her attic room. Her hands were cracked and bleeding, her shoulders ached from wringing heavy linens. And the manuscript room, the whole reason she had come to this house, remained as unreachable as ever. She had managed only one brief reconnaissance. The room was on the ground floor, adjacent to the Duke's study, accessed through a door that was kept locked. Mrs. Selmore carried the key on her ring. The cabinets inside, visible through a window that looked onto the inner courtyard, were glass-fronted and appeared to be organized by subject. Cassia could see the spines of bound manuscripts, some of which she recognized as her father's work. His handwriting, visible even at a distance on the labels, was like seeing a ghost. The original will and deed were in there, hidden inside a volume of Epictetus that her father had translated and annotated in the summer of his second visit. He had told Reverend Osprey as much in his letter. But the room was locked. Mrs. Mutt Selmore held the key, and the Duke worked in the adjacent study from dawn until well past dark. There was no way in, unless she went at night. The thought had been circling in her mind for weeks, a vulture over a carcass. It was dangerous. If she were caught in a locked room that she had no business entering, no excuse would save her. It would mean dismissal. It could mean the constable, but the alternative was to remain here indefinitely, scrubbing copper and polishing floors while her inheritance gathered dust behind a pane of glass. The decision was made for her on a cold Thursday evening. She was carrying a basket of pressed linens through the ground floor corridor when she heard voices from behind Mrs. Selmore's sitting room door. The housekeeper was speaking to someone, and the tone of the conversation stopped Cassia in her tracks. "The girl is still here," Mrs. Selmore was saying, her voice low and tight. "I have done everything I can. She does not break. She does not complain. She does not leave." A man's voice replied, muffled by the door. Cassia pressed herself against the wall and strained to listen. She could not make out the words, but the voice was not one she recognized from the household. It was an outside visitor. Mrs. Selmore spoke again. "I have told you. There is nothing to connect her to anything. She is just a maid. But I want her gone, Renard. I do not like the way she watches." Cassia's blood turned to ice. Renard, Mrs. Selmore's brother, the man who had stolen her life. He was here. He was in this house. And she heard footsteps approaching the door, and she moved quickly and silently, around the corner and out of sight. She leaned against the cold stone wall, the basket of linens clutched to her chest, and fought to control her breathing. He was here. The coincidence was too precise. Mrs. Selmore had not recognized her. Cassia was certain of that. But the housekeeper's instincts were sharp, and something about Nell had set them ringing. She had summoned her brother as a precaution, a consultation. How long before one of them made the connection? How long before Reynard Selmore looked at the quiet maid with the gray-green eyes and saw the girl he had cast out 2 years ago? She had to act tonight. There would be no second chance. She waited until the house was asleep. The clock in the servants' hall struck midnight, each chime falling into the darkness like a stone into deep water. Cassia rose from her bed. She was fully dressed, her feet in thin slippers that made no sound on the bare boards. She carried no candle. She had walked these corridors so many times in the dark that she could navigate them by touch and memory alone. She descended the back stairs, her hand trailing along the cold plaster wall. The kitchen was dark and silent, the great range ticking as it cooled. She passed through the scullery, the still room, the boot room. She reached the green baize door that separated the servants' world from the family side of the house, and eased it open. The main corridor stretched before her, a tunnel of shadow. Moonlight fell through the tall windows in pale geometric shapes on the stone floor. She moved through them like a swimmer moving through patches of cold and warm water. The manuscript room door was ahead. She reached it and tried the handle. Locked, as she had known it would be. But she had prepared for this. 3 days ago, while cleaning the housekeeper's sitting room, she had taken an impression of the key in a ball of candle wax. Last night she had used a hairpin and a nail file to fashion a crude pick. It was not elegant, but the lock was old, and old locks were forgiving. She knelt before the door, inserted the pick, and worked it with the patience of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to endure. The tumblers resisted. She adjusted the angle, tried again. A click, soft as a whisper, the handle turned. She was inside. The room smelled of paper and age and the faint chemical tang of the preservative that had been used on the older manuscripts. The glass-fronted cabinets lined the walls, their contents barely visible in the moonlight. Cassia moved to the cabinet on the far wall, the one that held the translations of Greek philosophy. Her eyes, adjusted to the dark, could make out the spines. Aristotle, Plato, Seneca. And there, on the third shelf, a set of volumes bound in dark blue leather with gold lettering. Her father's hand, his work. She opened the cabinet door. It was not locked. Her fingers found the volume of Epictetus, the one her father had described. She pulled it out carefully, cradling it as though it were a living thing. She opened the front cover. Nothing. She turned the pages slowly, feeling for any irregularity, any hidden pocket or folded paper. Page after page of her father's beautiful, precise handwriting, his annotations in the margins. His thoughts, his questions, his little jokes written to himself in Greek. She was halfway through the volume when she heard the sound, a door opening. Not the door she had come through, but the connecting door from the Duke's study. Light spilled into the manuscript room, a sudden golden flood that made her throw up a hand to shield her eyes. He was standing in the doorway, a lamp in one hand, his expression unreadable. He was still dressed. He had not been to bed. His dark eyes moved from her face to the book in her hands, and then to the open cabinet behind her. Neither of them spoke. The silence was immense, a living thing that pressed against the walls. "You are the one who writes the notes," he said. It was not a question. Cassia could not deny it. The volume in her hands, the cabinet, the room itself, all of it pointed to a knowledge of manuscripts and classical texts that no ordinary maid could possess, the same knowledge that had informed every note she had left beside his plate. She stood motionless, the book pressed against her chest, and met his gaze. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. He stepped into the room. The lamplight moved with him, pushing the shadows back into the corners. He set the lamp on the reading table and turned to face her, fully. In the warm light, his face was all sharp planes and deep hollows. The severity she had seen from a distance was, up close, something more complex. There was exhaustion in it, and vigilance, and a guarded, wounded intelligence. "Mrs. Selmore believes you are a thief," he said. "She has told me so on 3 separate occasions. She says you are deceitful, that you are above your station, that you should be dismissed at once." He paused. "I am beginning to think Mrs. Selmore is wrong about a great many things." Cassius said nothing. Her heart was hammering so violently she was certain he could hear it. He looked at the book she was holding. "That is from the Thorn translations. My father commissioned them. The scholar who produced them was a man named Aldous Thorn." He said the name carefully, watching her face for a reaction. "He worked in this room for 3 summers. I was a boy. I remember him. A quiet man. Kind." Cassia's grip on the book tightened. She could feel the tears building behind her eyes, but she would not let them fall. "Not yet. Not here." "Why are you holding his book at 1 in the morning?" Emery asked. The question was quiet, almost gentle. "Because it is the only thing in this house that still belongs to me." The words left her mouth before she could stop them. They were the truest thing she had said since crossing the threshold of Aldermere, and they hung in the air between them like a confession. He stared at her. She could see the machinery of his mind working, the connections forming, the questions multiplying. Scholar's daughter, classical languages, the notes, the Stoic quotations, the handwriting that matched the annotations in the manuscripts. His lips parted as though he were about to speak, but then he closed them again and simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not anger, not suspicion, but the dawning of an understanding so profound it seemed to change the shape of his face. "Who are you?" he asked. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times. She had imagined herself lying, deflecting, spinning another story. But standing in her father's room, holding her father's book, facing a man who had just quoted her father's name, with genuine respect, she found that the lies would not come. They were exhausted. They had been used up, every last one, and all that remained was the truth. "My name is Cassia Thorn," she said. "Aldous Thorn was my father." He did not react with shock. He received the information the way a mathematician receives the solution to a problem he has been working on for weeks, with a quiet, profound satisfaction. He nodded once. He did not ask her to prove it. He did not challenge her. He looked at the book in her arms, and at her face, and at her red, work-roughened hands, and something shifted in him. She could see it, a hardening of the jaw, a darkening of the eyes, not directed at her, directed at the world that had put a scholar's daughter on her knees with a scrub brush. "You will return the book to the shelf," he said, his voice careful and controlled. "You will go back to your room. You will say nothing to anyone about this. In the morning, things will be different." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him everything, about Renard Selmore, about the forged will, about the deed hidden somewhere in these volumes. But the look on his face stopped her. It was the look of a man who has just taken ownership of a problem and has no intention of sharing it. She placed the book back on the shelf. She closed the cabinet door. She walked to the door of the manuscript room and paused, her hand on the frame. She did not look back at him. "The notes were not a strategy," she said quietly. "They were not part of any plan. I wrote them because you were in pain, and I recognized it." She left the room. He stood alone among his father's manuscripts, the lamp burning low, and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle onto his shoulders, not a burden, a responsibility, a debt that his family owed, and that he, as its head, was now honor-bound to pay. The next morning, Mrs. Selmore requested an audience. She entered the Duke's study with the particular confidence of a woman who believes she holds the winning hand. Her brother had left the previous evening, but his visit had fortified her. She had information now. Not proof, but information, and she intended to use it. "Your Grace," she began, I must bring a serious matter to your attention. The maid, Nell, was observed leaving her room after midnight. She was seen entering the ground floor corridor. I believe she intended to access the manuscript room. Observed by whom? Emery asked. He was seated behind his desk, his hands flat on the surface, his face betraying nothing. By myself, Your Grace. I have been vigilant, given the ongoing matter of the notes. You followed her. I did. And you saw her enter the manuscript room. I saw her approach the door. I did not witness her enter, but her intent was clear. She had no business in that part of the house at that hour. I believe this confirms what I have long suspected. The girl is not what she claims. She is deceitful and potentially dangerous. I recommend immediate dismissal and an investigation of any items that may be missing from the collection. Emery let the silence stretch. He looked at the woman who had served his family for nearly 2 decades. He had trusted her. He had relied on her judgment in 100 household matters. She had been a fixture of his life, as much a part of Aldermere as the stonework, and now she was lying to his face. He had been in the manuscript room when Cassia entered. He had been there all night, unable to sleep, drawn to his father's old papers by a restlessness he could not name. He had heard the door open. He had watched from the connecting study. Mrs. Selmore had not been there. She had not followed anyone. She had not observed anything. She was fabricating a case against a woman whose only crime was the quiet dignity that Mrs. Selmore found so threatening. Or was it more than that? The name, Selmore. The brother, Renard, who had visited just yesterday. A scholar named Thorne who had worked in this house. A girl named Cassia Thorne who was now scrubbing his floors. The connections were forming, sharp and clear. He was not ready to reveal them. Not yet. He needed certainty first. Mrs. Selmore, he said, his voice as level and cold as a frozen lake. The girl was not prowling the corridors last night. She was summoned by me. The housekeeper's composure fractured, a hairline crack quickly sealed, but he saw it. By you, Your Grace. I required a volume from the manuscript room. I did not wish to disturb Mr. Crail at that hour. The girl was awake, attending to mending in the servants' hall, and I sent word through Gerald the footman. She retrieved the book and returned to her quarters. There was no trespass. There was no theft. There was a servant obeying a direct instruction from the master of this house. Every word was a lie, delivered with the casual authority of absolute truth. Mrs. Selmore knew it was a lie. He could see the knowledge in her eyes, the fury and the fear competing for dominance, but she could not challenge him. To call the Duke of Westhaven a liar in his own study would be to end her career in a single sentence. "I see, Your Grace," she said, her voice stripped of everything but the bare mechanics of deference. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. There is nothing to apologize for. Your vigilance is noted." He paused, and when he spoke again, his tone carried an edge of warning that could have cut glass. "But I will not have my staff persecuted on the basis of suspicion and personal dislike. The girl does her work. She causes no trouble. She will remain in her position and she will be treated fairly. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Grace. You may go." She left the room. She did not close the door quietly. It was not a slam, nothing so crude. But the firmness of the latch carried a message that even the walls could read. She had been outmaneuvered, publicly contradicted, and stripped of authority in the space of 5 minutes. And she knew with the cold certainty of a woman whose instincts had kept her alive in great houses for 30 years that something fundamental had shifted. Emery waited until her footsteps had faded. Then he pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and began to write. The letter was addressed to a firm of solicitors in York, men he trusted, men who had served his family for generations. He described in precise and measured terms a situation involving a contested will, a young woman named Cassia Thorne, and a man named Renard Selmore. He asked them to investigate the probate of the late Aldous Thorne's estate with the utmost discretion and urgency. He asked them to verify the existence of a property called Briar Cottage in Devon and to establish its current legal ownership. Then he wrote a second letter, shorter, to a private inquiry agent in London. He asked the man to compile a complete history of Renard Selmore, his finances, his associates, his professional reputation, and any connection to a housekeeper named Selmore, currently employed at Aldermere Hall in Yorkshire. He sealed both letters and rang for Gerald. "These go with the Morning Post," he said. "And Gerald, one more thing. The manuscript room is to remain unlocked from this day forward. I may wish to access it at any hour. Leave the key with me." The footman's eyes widened slightly, but he knew better than to question. "Yes, Your Grace." Emery watched him leave, then turned to the window. The rain had stopped. A pale, watery sun was breaking through the clouds, throwing long shadows across the east lawn. He thought of Cassia Thorne, somewhere in the house at this moment, scrubbing or polishing or pressing linens, her scholar's hands raw from lye, her father's legacy locked behind glass. He thought of Enora. His sister had spoken of a friend she had made as a child, a girl who visited with her father, a girl who knew the names of flowers and could read Greek. Emery had half listened at the time, distracted by whatever had occupied a young man's mind. The memory surfaced now with a terrible clarity. What was her name? Enora had said. "She is the cleverest person I have ever met, and she is only 12. Cassia. It had been Cassia. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Enora's childhood friend. A girl who had played in these gardens, who had laughed in these corridors, who had belonged in this house in a way no maid's uniform could erase. And she had been here for 6 weeks, invisible, suffering, while he sat in his study and nursed his grief like a man tending a fire. He refused to let go out. He pressed his hand against the window glass. It was cold. The cold was good. It sharpened things. It stripped away the fog of guilt and self-pity and made the edges of the world clear. He knew what he had to do. He would find the proof she was looking for. He would do it himself. And then he would bring the truth into the light and watch it burn away every lie that had been constructed around her. But he would do it properly, methodically, with the patience and precision of a man who understood that justice, unlike vengeance, required evidence. The replies to his letters came 10 days later. They arrived on the same morning, one from York and one from London, and Emery read them in the privacy of his study, with the door locked and the curtains drawn. The solicitors in York had been thorough. The probate of Aldous Thorne's estate was, in their professional opinion, deeply irregular. The revised will had been witnessed by 2 men who were known associates of Renard Selmore. The solicitor who had filed it, a man named Palliser, had since been struck off the rolls for fraudulent practice in 3 separate cases. The original will, which the solicitors had found referenced in Thorne's earlier correspondence with his bank, named his daughter Cassia as sole beneficiary. No copy of this original will had been located in any public archive. The inquiry agent's report on Renard Selmore was shorter but more damning. Selmore had a history of minor fraud, of debts settled with borrowed money, of associates who moved in the gray territory between the law and its shadow. He had sold the Thorne book collection to a dealer in London for a sum that the agent described as considerable. The property, Briar Cottage, had been retitled in Selmore's name and was currently let to tenants for an income that exceeded what a man of his modest station should have been able to command. And then, at the bottom of the agent's report, a single line that made Emery's hands go still. Selmore's elder sister, one Gwendolen Selmore, is currently employed as housekeeper at Aldermere Hall, seat of the Duke of Westhaven. He set the papers down. He stared at them for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the connecting door, and entered the manuscript room. He worked for hours. He went through every volume in the cabinet one by one, with the same methodical care he applied to his estate accounts. He checked bindings, shook pages, felt for irregularities in the end papers. He was looking for what Cassia had been looking for: the original will, the deed, the proof that would undo 2 years of calculated theft. He found it in the late afternoon, as the light through the courtyard window was turning gold. The volume of Epictetus, the same book Cassia had been holding that night. He had missed it on his first pass because the hiding place was so clever. Aldous Thorne had carefully slit the inner lining of the back cover and created a pocket between the leather and the board. Inside were 2 documents, folded flat and preserved by the dry, stable air of the cabinet. The first was a deed of title for Briar Cottage, naming Cassia Marguerite Thorne as sole owner. The second was a will, handwritten by Aldous Thorne and witnessed by 2 men whose names Emery recognized. One was a professor of classics at Cambridge, the other was his own father. His father, the old Duke of Westhaven, had witnessed Aldous Thorne's will. He had known the man, he had known his wishes. And when Thorne died, the old Duke was already in his own decline, his memory failing, his papers in chaos. The connection had been lost, the trust had been broken. Not by malice, but by the simple, devastating incompetence of a great house in the throes of its own succession. Emery sat at the reading table, the documents spread before him, and felt the full measure of his family's failure. A man had entrusted his daughter's future to the Duke of Westhaven, and the Duke of Westhaven had let it slip through his fingers like water. Cassia Thorne had been robbed not once, but twice. First by Selmore, and then by the carelessness of the very family she had turned to for protection. He gathered the documents carefully. He placed them in a leather folder. He locked the folder in his desk. Then he summoned the footman and spoke 2 sentences that would change the course of 3 lives. Find Mrs. Selmore and the maid, Nell. Bring them both to the manuscript room. The walk from the kitchen to the manuscript room took Cassia 4 minutes. It was the longest 4 minutes of her life, longer than the night she had spent in the rain after Selmore threw her out, longer than the morning she had buried her father and stood alone at the graveside because there was no one left to stand with her. Gerald had delivered the summons with a face so pale it looked like parchment, and his words had been spare and terrible. His Grace requires you in the manuscript room. Mrs. Selmore has been sent for as well. She understood what it meant. She did not know which version of the ending awaited her, triumph or ruin, but she knew it was the ending. She straightened her cap, smoothed her apron, and walked. Mrs. Selmore was already there when Cassia arrived. The housekeeper stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, her spine rigid. Her face was composed, but there was a tightness around her mouth that betrayed calculation. She clearly believed this was the final act of the drama she had been orchestrating for weeks. The Duke had finally seen through the girl. The girl would be dismissed, order would be restored. Then Cassia entered, and Mrs. Selmore's eyes moved from her face to the Duke's desk, and her expression changed. The leather folder was open on the reading table. Beside it lay the volume of Epictetus, its back cover visibly slit, the hidden pocket exposed. 2 documents were spread flat on the polished surface, their edges weighted with small brass paperweights. Even from across the room, Cassia could see her father's handwriting on the will. She could see the deed. Her breath stopped. The Duke stood behind the table, his hands at his sides. He was very still. His face held an expression Cassia had never seen on him before. It was not the cold severity she had come to associate with him, nor the guarded curiosity of their encounter in this room. It was something rawer, a controlled, terrible anger, and beneath it a sorrow, so deep it seemed to run all the way down to the bedrock of who he was. He looked at Cassia first. His gaze held hers for a long moment, and in it she read an apology that he had not yet spoken. Then he turned to Mrs. Selmore. "You have served this house for 17 years, he said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. But the quietness now had a weight to it, a density, like the silence before a thunderclap. My father trusted you. I trusted you. I relied on your judgment and your honesty, and I believed that the order you maintained was rooted in fairness." Mrs. Selmore's chin lifted. "It is, Your Grace." "Then explain this." He gestured to the documents on the table. "You told me the girl was a thief. You told me she was sly and dangerous. You fabricated a story about following her through the corridors. You recommended her dismissal on 3 occasions. And in all that time, you never once mentioned that your brother, Renard Selmore, had defrauded a young woman of her entire inheritance, stolen her property, sold her father's life's work, and left her destitute." The color left Mrs. Selmore's face in stages, like water draining from a basin. First the cheeks, then the lips, then the skin around her eyes, until she was as gray as the stone walls of the room. "You knew," the Duke continued, each word measured and precise. "Perhaps you did not know the details. Perhaps you told yourself your brother's version of events. But you knew that a man named Thorne had left a daughter, and you knew that daughter had been dispossessed. And when a quiet, intelligent girl arrived in your household and stirred some instinct of recognition in you, you set out to destroy her before anyone could discover why." He turned to Cassia. His expression changed as his gaze found her. The anger receded, replaced by something gentler and infinitely more difficult to bear. "Is that not so, Miss Thorne?" Her real name, spoken aloud in the room where her father had worked, in the presence of the woman whose family had ruined her. It struck her like a bell. The sound of it moved through her body, through the 2 years of silence and labor, and careful, exhausting pretense, and it shattered something that had been holding all of it together. She did not collapse. Ha! She did not fall to her knees or throw herself on his mercy. She simply stood, her shoulders straight, her eyes bright with tears that she finally allowed to fall, and she nodded. "Yes, Your Grace," she whispered. "That is so, Mrs. Selmore made a sound. It was small and strangled, halfway between a gasp and a moan. Her hands, so long clasped in rigid composure, began to tremble. "I did not know," she said, her voice barely audible. "My brother told me the girl was a fraud. He said the father had debts. He said the will was legitimate." "Your brother is a liar and a thief," Emery said. His voice held no pleasure in the accusation. It was flat, final, a statement of fact established by evidence and beyond dispute. The original will names Miss Thorne as the sole beneficiary. It was witnessed by a Cambridge professor and by my own father. The Duke of Westhaven stood as guarantor of Aldous Thorne's wishes, and those wishes were betrayed. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice cracked a single hairline fracture in his control. "They were betrayed in this house. By this family's negligence my father knew. He witnessed the will, and when Thorne died, the documents were here, in this room, and no one thought to look. The room was silent. The autumn light fell through the courtyard window in long golden bars. Motes of dust hung suspended in the air, motionless, as though even the dust were holding its breath. Mrs. Selmore looked at the documents on the table, at the girl she had spent 6 weeks persecuting, at the Duke whose trust she had squandered with lies and petty malice, and she seemed to deflate. The rigid posture sagged. The sharp angles of her face softened into something older and more pitiable. She was not a monster. She was a small, frightened woman who had built her life on control and order and loyalty to a brother who was not worthy of it, and now every pillar had been kicked out from under her. "What will happen to me?" she asked. "Maddox." The question was not addressed to Emery. It was addressed to the air, to the room, to whatever impersonal force governed the fates of women who had made themselves complicit in cruelty. Emery looked at Cassia. The question was in his eyes. She understood it. He was asking her what justice looked like. He was offering her the choice. She thought of the weeks of scrubbing, the invented infractions, the isolation, the deliberate campaign to break her spirit. She thought of Mrs. Selmore standing over her in the corridor, pointing at a spotless floor and calling it filthy. She thought of the cold, dark attic room and the bleeding hands, and the nights she had lain awake wondering if she would ever be herself again. And then she thought of her father. What would he have done? He would have been fair. He was always fair. Fairness was the architecture of his entire life, the principle that governed his scholarship, his friendships, his fatherhood. He would not have destroyed a woman for being weak and frightened and loyal to the wrong person. She should go, Cassia said quietly, but she should not be cast out. A cottage somewhere on the estate, a pension, something small, something quiet. She did not steal from me. Her brother did. She was only complicit in her ignorance, and complicity born of ignorance is not the same as malice. Emery stared at her. In his eyes, she saw something shift. Something ancient and immovable, a wall built from grief and duty and the conviction that the world was fundamentally unjust, began to develop a crack. She was giving mercy to the woman who had tormented her. She was choosing fairness over revenge, and she was doing it with the same quiet, immovable dignity that had first made him look up from his ledgers and pay attention. "So it will be," he said softly. Mrs. Selmore was led from the room by Mr. Crail, who had been summoned for the purpose. She did not resist. She did not plead. She walked out of Aldermere Hall the same way she had walked into it 17 years ago, with her back straight and her face composed. But something essential had been removed from her, and everyone who saw her pass through the corridors that afternoon could feel it. She was an empty vessel now, a woman without a kingdom. A carriage took her to a cottage on the northern boundary of the estate, a small stone building with a garden and a view of the moors. She would live there for the rest of her days, attended by a woman from the village, provided for by the very man whose household she had ruled. Cassia and Emery were left alone in the manuscript room. The documents lay on the table between them, the evidence of her father's love and her enemy's greed. The evening light was fading, turning the room to amber. "These are yours," Emery said, pushing the folder toward her. "They always were. My family failed your father's trust, and in doing so, we failed you. I cannot undo what was done. I cannot give you back the years, but I can ensure that what belongs to you is returned, completely and without condition." Cassia picked up the deed. She held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the age of the paper, the ghost of her father's fingers on its surface. Briar Cottage. Her home. The place where she had learned to read, where her father had taught her Greek by the fire on winter evenings, where the roses climbed the south wall and the blackbird sang at dawn. "Thank you," she said. The words were insufficient, a teacup trying to hold an ocean, but they were all she had. He shook his head. "Do not thank me. You did this yourself. You came into a house that should have protected you, and instead it tried to break you, and you endured. Every morning you woke and put on that apron and scrubbed floors that did not need scrubbing, and you never once broke. You never once lost yourself." He paused, and his voice, when it came again, was rough, with an emotion he was clearly fighting to contain. "And in the middle of all of it, you took the time to leave notes for a man you did not know, because you recognized his pain." He looked at her. "I have done nothing. You have done everything." She wanted to tell him that was not true. She wanted to tell him that his lie to Mrs. Selmore had saved her, that his quiet observation from the landing had been the first moment in 2 years when she had felt seen. She wanted to tell him that writing those notes had not been charity, it had been survival. Reaching out to him had been the only thing that kept her own grief from swallowing her whole, but the words would not come. The distance between them, the gulf of station and circumstance and the raw newness of truth was still too wide to cross with words. So she simply stood, holding her father's deed, and looked at the man who had found it for her, and let the silence speak. He cleared his throat. "You will not return to the servants' quarters. A room will be prepared for you, in the east wing. My father's manuscript collection is in disarray, and it has needed a qualified hand for years. I am offering you a position as curator at a proper salary, with full autonomy over the work. You will report to no one but me. He hesitated, and for the first time since she had known him, the mask of severity slipped, revealing something uncertain, almost shy. If you wish to stay, you are under no obligation. You have your property, you have your proof, you are free to leave. She looked around the room, her father's books, her father's handwriting on the spines. The courtyard window, through which she had once, as a girl of 12, watched Honora chase a butterfly through the lavender. This house had been a prison. It had also been her father's happiest place. And somewhere between the two, in the space occupied by a man who ate alone and a woman who wrote in the dark, it had become something else, something she was not yet ready to name. I will stay, she said. 8 months had passed, and Aldermere had remembered how to breathe. The change was not sudden. It came the way spring comes to the Yorkshire dales. Slowly, stubbornly, in increments so small, they were almost invisible until one morning you looked up and the world was green. A window left open in the music room. But a vase of wildflowers on the hall table, the sound of footsteps in corridors that had been silent for too long, and voices, actual voices, carrying through rooms that had forgotten what conversation sounded like. Cassia stood in the manuscript room, a volume of Herodotus in her hands, morning light pouring through the courtyard window. She was no longer in gray. She wore a gown of deep blue linen, simple and well made, the kind of garment that suited a woman who spent her days among books and her evenings in the company of a man who valued substance over ornament. Her hair was unpinned, gathered loosely at her shoulders, and her hands, though they still bore the faint scars of lye and hard water, were healing. A scholar's hands again. The room had been transformed. She had spent months on it, cataloging, reorganizing, preserving, repairing bindings, and commissioning new translations of damaged texts. Her father's work was now properly displayed, his annotations cross-referenced, his translations bound in volumes that bore his name in gold on the spine. It was the legacy he had deserved, and building it had been the most meaningful work of her life. But the room was not just a monument to the past, it was alive. Students from the university in York had begun visiting, by invitation, to consult the collection. A professor of ancient philosophy had declared it one of the 3 finest private holdings of Stoic texts in England. Letters arrived weekly from scholars requesting access. Aldermere, once sealed tight as a tomb, was opening, and at the center of it all, quiet and purposeful as ever, was Cassia. She heard his step in the corridor before she saw him. She knew the sound of it now, the particular weight and rhythm of a man who had learned, slowly and with great difficulty, to walk through his own house without flinching at every memory. Emery appeared in the doorway, and she looked up, and the small, private smile that passed between them was a conversation in itself, one that had been building for months in the spaces between their words. He had changed. The severity was still there, the sharp angles of his face, the dark eyes that saw everything and revealed little, but the rigidity was gone. The man who had eaten alone in a dining room built for 24, who had sealed his sister's chambers and dismissed the world, had been replaced by someone who was still quiet, still careful, still fundamentally serious, but who was present in a way he had not been before. He smiled now. Not often and never extravagantly, but the smiles were real, and each one felt like a door opening in a house that had been locked for too long. "Lady Sibyl is arriving this afternoon," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "She sent word from Harrogate, she says, and I quote from her letter, that she wishes to inspect the progress and see if you have managed to—" Cassia laughed. It was still a sound that surprised her, the ease of it, the way it rose naturally from her chest without the old flinch of caution. "She will be disappointed. I have barely managed to organize the Greek section. Civilizing you was never part of the commission. She will be delighted, and you know it." He paused. "She is bringing a guest, a barrister from York. He has completed the case against Selmore. There will be a formal settlement. Cassius set down the book. The Selmore matter had been grinding through the legal machinery for months, propelled by the Duke's solicitors with a relentlessness that reflected Emery's own quiet fury. Renard Selmore had been confronted with the original will, the deed, the testimony of the Cambridge professor, and the damning report of the inquiry agent. He had contested nothing. He had produced no defense because there was no defense to produce. Briar Cottage had been restored to Cassia's name. The funds from the sale of her father's book collection, plus interest and damages, were being recovered. Selmore himself faced prosecution for fraud. "It is nearly over then," she said softly. "It is." He walked into the room and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid, steady presence that had become, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, the fixed point around which her days revolved. He looked at the volume in her hands. Herodotus. "My father's favorite. I know. He wrote a note in the margin of Book 7. He said it was the finest account of courage he had ever read." She opened the volume and showed him the annotation. The old Duke's handwriting faded, but legible. "Your father loved this collection, Emery. He understood what it meant. He understood many things," Emery said quietly. "He understood your father. He understood the value of the work." He paused. "I think he would have understood you." She looked at him. The light from the window caught his face, softening the angles, and she saw in his expression something that had been growing for months, quietly, persistently, like a vine climbing a wall. He had been patient. He was always patient. He had given her time to reclaim her name, her work, her independence. He had never presumed. He had never assumed that his intervention entitled him to anything from her. He had simply been there, a presence as constant and undemanding as the notes she had once left beside his plate. "Walk with me," he said. "The lake is beautiful in this light." They walked together through the grounds, past the gardens where Cassia had once weeded flower beds on her hands and knees, past the stable yard where Thomas, the former hall boy, now worked as a groom's apprentice, past the kitchen garden where the cook, Mrs. Sess, Harrow, was hanging herbs to dry in the autumn sun. Everywhere there were signs of life, of restoration, of a household that had found its rhythm again. The lake was still and silver, reflecting the high white clouds and the dark line of trees on the far shore. This was the place where Honora had died, and for a long time Emery had avoided it. But Cassia had suggested, gently, that avoiding a place did not erase what had happened there. It only gave the grief more power. He had come back to the lake in the spring, alone at first, then with Cassia. They had stood together on the shore, and he had spoken about Honora for the first time without his voice breaking, and Cassia had told him about the summer she and Honora had caught frogs in the shallows and named everyone after a Greek philosopher. He had almost smiled that day. Today, he did smile, standing at the water's edge with the wind ruffling his dark hair and the sun warm on his face. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the notes. The notes. The ones you left beside my plate. I still have them, all of them, in the leather case in my desk." He turned to face her. "You wrote that grief is not a room to live in. It is a corridor to walk through, and there is a door at the end." "I remember. I have walked the corridor," he said. His voice was low, steady, but she could hear the current beneath it, the depth of feeling that this man, this careful, methodical, deeply private man, had spent months learning not to hide from. "And I believe I have found the door, but I find I cannot open it alone." She waited. The lake lapped softly at the stones. "I am not a man who speaks easily about these things," he said. "You know that I am slow. I am cautious. I approach matters of consequence the way I approach everything else, with deliberation, and often too much of it." He took her hand. His fingers were warm and certain around hers. "But I have deliberated enough. I have been certain for months. I was certain the night you told me your name in this room. I was certain the morning you showed mercy to a woman who had shown you none. I have been certain every evening when I sit at that table, where there are now 2 places set instead of 1, and I look across at you and think that the silence in this house has finally become the kind worth keeping." He lifted her hand and held it between both of his. "I am asking you to stay, not as my curator, not as my guest, as my wife, as the Duchess of Westhaven, as the woman who left a note beside a lonely man's plate and changed the course of his life." Cassia looked at him. She looked at his face, at the eyes that had once been shuttered and cold and were now open, vulnerable, entirely hers. She looked at the lake where a girl named Honora had once laughed and splashed and lived. She looked at the great house on the hill, the house that had been her father's joy and her own prison, and was now, against every expectation, her home. "You should know," she said, her voice thick with a happiness so fierce it felt almost like pain, "that I have one condition." His brow lifted. "Name it. I am keeping the manuscript room." The smile that broke across his face was the fullest, warmest, most unguarded expression she had ever seen him make. It transformed him. It made him young. It made him look like the brother of the girl who had once chased butterflies through the lavender. "I would not dream of taking it from you," he said. He did not kiss her then. It was not his way. Instead, he kept her hand in his, and they stood together at the edge of the lake, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full. It was the silence of 2 people who had found each other in the dark, who had spoken through folded paper and careful observation, and the slow, stubborn work of trust, and who had arrived, at last, at a place where words were no longer necessary. That evening, for the first time in the history of Aldermere Hall, 2 places were set at the great dining table, and beside the Duke's plate, in the place where a folded note had once appeared, there was a small piece of paper. He opened it. The handwriting was his own. It read, "Thank you for staying," and, across the table, Cassia Thorne, scholar, curator, and future Duchess of Westhaven, smiled at him with the quiet, luminous certainty of a woman who had finally come home.